The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement is a free trade agreement that is a replacement for the North American Free Trade Agreement. The author chose to pull a news article from all three countries involved. The second and third are from the United States, and the last is from Mexico. But this will begin with a Canadian newspaper. The first article to be discussed was written by Wenran Yang, who is a fellow at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, University of British Columbia. It was published in the Globe and Mail, which is headquartered in Toronto, Canada. Yang paints an extremely unfavorable opinion on the new USMCA and on the Canadian government in general. He opens with the replacement for NAFTA being pretty standard and predictable in relation to dairy farming, steel, and aluminum tariffs, and the dispute settlement mechanisms. However, there is one area in particular that he is, for lack of better terms, extremely disappointed in. The area in question is Article 32.10, Non-Market Country Free Trade Agreements. The easy explanation is that Canada must receive approval from the other agreement partners in order to negotiate with an external, non-market economy. Specifically, 30 days in advance, Canada must provide details on the negotiations to the U.S. and to Mexico. Yang feels this is a direct attack on Canada's ability to broker a trade agreement with China for energy and agricultural products. He further goes on to explain that the only way the U.S. will allow such negotiations is if it is beneficial to the United States and their ability to further control China in the global economy. Yang argues that it is a direct attack on Canada's sovereignty, and he worries that the U.S. will try and get other free trade agreement partners, such as Japan and the European Union, to do similar clauses towards China. Yang feels that Canada gave in too easily and did have other options. The first being that Canada could have remained firm until the language was changed to reflect Canada's independence. Yang further goes on to explain that it would have hurt the United States even more to be in a trading war with Canada and China, its two biggest export partners. The second article was written by Republican Senator Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania. It was published in the Wall Street Journal immediately after the midterm elections. This article is extremely interesting because it clearly expresses the role of politics in the international free trade world. From the author's impression, Senator Toomey is for the USMCA and lists some pros and cons of the new suggested agreement. However, the senator feels in order for this to be approved by legislature, it needs to be accomplished before the majority Democrat House gets sworn in after the 2019 Congress is convened. Senator Toomey refers to the agreement as a mixed bag of trade enhancing and trade restricting changes. The pros he suggests are the new protections on intellectual property rights, new verbiage concerning digital trade, and lastly, the removal of localized data storage requirements. Unfortunately, he feels the additions are outweighed by the wage requirements on auto manufacturing, requirements for aluminum and steel quotas, and the expiration date of 16 years after the signing of the new agreement, and lastly, the limitations on investor dispute protections. The senator lists three options for the future of the free trade agreement for Mexico, Canada, and the United States. The first, referred to as the nuclear option, is to completely withdraw from the agreement, which could be disastrous for the U.S. economy. Second is to add nothing and hope that it gets passed by a majority Democrat House in 2019. Lastly is for the president to make a few small adjustments that would not require renegotiations with Mexico and Canada, and get it passed this year while the legislative branch is still in possession of the Republican Party. In the author's opinion, Heather Long posted the most unbiased, unpolitical post concerning the USMCA. It was straightforward and listed winners, losers, and unsure effects on all three countries. It was written and published in the Washington Post the day the draft was approved. She initiates the article with quotes from both President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau discussing what a great deal it is. The article lists the first win for President Trump. The president was able to keep a promise to his voters right before midterm elections. Next, the article lists the Prime Minister Trudeau and Canada came out as winners because of two key issues: protection for Canadian dairy farmers and Chapter 19, which is the dispute resolution mechanism. Canadian dairy farmers are able to maintain the supply management, which includes U.S. imports, and the lumber industry is supported by Chapter 19. Labor unions received a major victory, requiring 30%, eventually 40%, of cars must be produced by workers earning a minimum of $16 an hour. Additionally, Mexican workers will now find it easier to form unions. Lastly, U.S. dairy farmers are able to maintain stable exports of certain products to Canada, specifically powdered dairy products. Now that this major trade deal is all but finalized, China will start feeling the trade pressure of the United States. Unfortunately, U.S. car buyers will start feeling the pain of the increase in labor prices and an increase in duties for certain small cars being imported. Big business is listed as the next loser in the deal. Increased regulatory costs and the loss of Chapter 11 benefits will cost companies more money. Lastly, Canadian steel and aluminum tariffs placed by President Trump are still present and will continue to hurt that Canadian industry. The final article to be discussed is from the Mexican newspaper Reform. Arguably, it was a challenge to completely understand the articles after their translation, but the author tried his best. Daniel Milian begins with a pretty profound quote. The possible has a value superior to the ideal. The perfect, if ungraspable, becomes the enemy of the good. This quote sums up the negotiation of the new agreement for all those concerned. Milian refers to the NAFTA Saga 2.0 as a plot, a challenge, and a teaching. By plot, Milian is referring to the risk associated with continuing the negotiations into 2019. This would prove disastrous considering the trade war with China and the tumultuous relationship with the European Union and Brexit. This would be coupled with changes in the U.S. House of Representatives and Mexico's elections in 2019. Signing the agreement sooner than later just adds more security for investors and thus the countries involved. This implied that concessions were made by all parties involved. In fact, the automotive industry in Mexico would receive some benefits, but also could hurt their exports of automotive components to the U.S. The challenge Milian discussed is that Mexico now needs to take full advantage of the agreement. Specifically, he suggests Mexico needs to increase the national industries and increase the value added during Mexican manufacturing. He further implies that Mexico needs to take full advantage of its free access to America, especially as America is closing its borders via tariffs and quotas to its other allies. The teaching referenced that both the current and future Mexican president knew how important the agreement was. Regardless of differing political views, the economic future of Mexico relies heavily on the trade with the U.S. Both individuals proved that they could put aside short-term political gains and look at the longevity of the country.